Baptist Community College. I love community colleges. I think they are the heart blood of public education, not only in North Carolina, but across the country. I know a lot of you support this community college, and let me tell you, there's not any better work to be done than that effort. So my hat is off to you. I also have great affection for Goldsboro. Even apart from folks like Tom and Jarrett, a lot of my heroes are Goldsboro folk. Phil Badur being one of them, Reverend Barber being another, who I know is probably not subject to uniform opinions, just like I'm not, but I've had the opportunity to work with him for many years, and I think he's a great asset to North Carolina and now the United States. So it's nice to be here in his home country. Phil mentioned Shirley Edwards, who I know some of you know, but as a mentor to me, brilliant, the largest heart I've ever known. Danielle Baptiste, who you may not know, but is over at the Dillard Academy and does remarkable work in low-income communities. Aideen George, Reverend George, some of you probably have, she surely would have put a bug in your ear. So she puts a bug in my ear in Chapel Hill all the time. So I'm assuming she is to you one of my great heroes. Pat Yates, who I don't know if any of you know, she was the head for many years of Wayne County literacy and has dedicated a life to those who sort of need a second chance. Teresia Benton, who runs the soup kitchen, some of you are involved with, and she runs it in ways atypical, I think, for such efforts. She's apparently on call 24 hours a day, which I wouldn't recommend, but she does it. Sylvia Barnes, who works a lot here through the NAACP. There are great heroes to me in Wayne County, in Goldsboro, so it's an honor to be here in the community. Given what Phil said too, as I start, I'm obliged to tell you that I don't speak for the University of North Carolina, in case you were wondering about that. My employer likes it if I say that. It didn't really seem necessary to me after they closed my Poverty Center and closed the Civil Rights Center. I'm barely allowed to speak at the University of North Carolina, much less for it. Though I will say, typical of our troubles, the University of North Carolina, you need to remember, is still the greatest public university in the world. But all the people who demanded that I put a disclaimer every time I write or speak publicly have since been fired at the University of North Carolina. Frankly, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It sort of depends on who they get replaced by. So I'm a little unsure about my mandated disclaimer. I thought about asking for a clarification, and I did that once before, and I'm just going to explain to you why I didn't ask for a clarification on this. When I was first asked or told that I need to put a disclaimer on everything that I write, I asked them, well, how does that work? I've got an article coming out in about a month in the Harvard Journal of Law and Policy, and another one coming out in the Duke Constitutional Law Journal in about 2 weeks after that. So am I supposed to put on there that I don't speak for the University of North Carolina? It's going to be kind of weird and embarrassing. And they said, no, hell no, you don't need to put that on something you wrote for the Harvard Law Review. Nobody in North Carolina reads the Harvard Law Review. It's It's only when you write for the Raleigh News and Observer that you need to explain that your employer hates you. So I said, okay, now I get it. So I was so disheartened by this advice that I haven't really gone back to the well to seek guidance since, and you'll understand that. I want to talk to you about an unhappy topic, and I'm grateful you would come out to talk about it. I was telling Phil a second ago that my wife is a voracious reader, and when this book was finished, and she reads when she goes to bed, and so she had been reading it about 3 or 4 nights, and she told me that she thought it was a good book, but that she was not reading it at night anymore because it made her mad, it made her upset, she couldn't sleep, and it was ruining her evenings. And so she was going to read it, but she would read it during the day. So I was saying, this is how I know now, whenever anybody comes up to me and says, well, I read your book and I really enjoyed it, then I know they're lying. They didn't actually read the book. It's not a fun read. North Carolina, just to start, has a lot of challenges. We all know that. Some of new ilk, some of older ilk. But its greatest one still, in my judgment, is poverty, wrenching poverty amidst great plenty, even if we don't like to think of it that way, in what is one of the most economically vibrant states of the richest nation on earth. Now also, we don't like to think of this either, the most unequal nation on earth. Biggest gaps between rich and poor, essentially in our history or anybody's history. Thomas Piketty is the famous international inequality scholar. He wrote last year that right now, economic inequality in the United States is higher than in any other society at any time in the past, anywhere in the world. So despite all our boasts and our purported commitments, we have become the richest, the poorest, and the most unequal major nation in the world. And that doesn't speak well of us. North Carolina, on average, a lot of you know, is worse. We have among the highest poverty rates and child poverty rates and hunger rates and food insecurity rates and rates of the uninsured, and now concentrating poverty rates among the states. Almost a quarter of our kids are poor. Over a third of all our children of color are poor in the wealthiest nation in history. Greensboro and High Point, 3 of the last 5 years, have been tagged by the federal government as the hungriest cities in the United States. We don't talk about that very much. You don't hear about it very much. They don't even like to talk about it in Greensboro or High Point. Charlotte, a lot of folks know because it was written up a lot 4 years ago, was Harvard and Stanford did a huge study and determined that Charlotte had the worst income mobility in the United States of the 50 major cities. Charlotte came in last, so that if you're born poor, a kid's born poor in Charlotte, you're less apt to work your way out of it than any other major city in the United States. You also likely know that the Pew Foundation said that Goldsboro was among the worst of the smaller communities in the entire country, and also indicated that the median household income drop over a decade here, 26%, was the second highest of any city in the United States. So it's not shocking anyone to say we've got real poverty challenges in North Carolina and even here. Last year, Lumberton and Roanoke Rapids were listed as 2 of the 3 poorest cities in the United States. Now those are statistics and data, and they're horrifying, and they're true. They're irrefutably true. But they rarely make their way into our public discourse. We don't talk much about it. These kind of issues don't raise their head really in our political campaigns. They are not talked about in the State House. They're not talked about enough on our campuses, in our public discourse, in our entertainment medias and the like. Tragically, maybe even in our pulpits. We ignore the challenges of poverty. We don't discuss them. We don't explore them. So we have the oddity of this being perhaps our largest problem and our least discussed. But think about it. Winston-Salem 3 years ago had the highest rate of hungry babies in the United States, kids under 5. North Carolina has frequently been in the top 4 states on that front. If having the highest number of hungry babies isn't enough to work its way into your political agenda, then I would wonder what is. I understand that Republicans and Democrats might have different theories for how to go about it, but the notion that we wouldn't even be talking about it, we wouldn't even elevate it to our public agenda and say, whatever else, when I'm done with my term, whatever it is, we're not going to have the most hungry babies in the United States. I don't know what else we're going to accomplish, but that's going to be one thing we're going to do. We don't tend to hear that. Part of the reason, not all of it, but part of the reason is poverty is largely invisible to many of us, to most of us. Sometimes it's purposefully invisible. I used to work some with a great fellow named Paul Wellstone when I was younger. And Paul would say, we turn our gaze away from those locked at the bottom. That's America's largest challenge. So this book tries a little bit, not very effectively, not very potently, but a little bit to pull the curtain back on the challenges of poverty. The method is pretty simple. I mainly use the words of poor people. Mostly this book, it has a lot of data in it, but mostly it's narrative, taken from hundreds of interviews of low-income people across North Carolina, some from Wayne County. But my goal is to sort of move beyond the statistics. It seems to me like statistics can be pretty horrifying, but if you're not inclined to pay attention to them, they're easy to ignore too. So we do a lot of work in narrative. And I've found that very frequently the most powerful way to explain what the challenges of poverty are to hear the words of poor people talking about what they face. So this book is a lot narrative based. It's hard to summarize it then. You know, what I'm going to do for the most part is tell 3 or maybe 4 stories from the book. And then I'm going to talk, maybe more controversially, about what North Carolina's response has largely been, particularly in the last decade, to the challenges of poverty, and suggest that we have work to do. But mostly I want to kind of turn to the pictures. So, doing that. First, this comes from the preface from Hickory, North Carolina. It is hard not to be taken with Hickory, North. Do you know where Hickory is, you guys? So it's hard not to be taken, at least at first blush, with Hickory. Nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, west of the urban Piedmont, Hickory's 40,000 residents can boast of broad avenues, a quaint city center, welcoming neighborhoods, massive and well-attended churches. Hickory has the look of an older, easier North Carolina. Even the name appeals. Hickory's been recognized as an All-American city. Reader's Digest designated it some years ago one of the 10 best places in the country to raise a family. But also in the last 15 years, Hickory has experienced immensely trying economic times. The pressures and alterations of global trade hit Hickory very hard. Many in that part of North Carolina, the same fate. Furniture and textile jobs, which had been the core of its economy, disappeared pretty quickly after NAFTA. In 2000, Hickory's unemployment rate was less than 2%. I should have known, but I didn't know anybody had an unemployment rate under 2%. Hickory was in good shape, well surpassing state and national averages. But by 2010, 10 years later, it soared to almost 16%. The fourth highest increase in unemployment of any city in the nation. A small manufacturing mecca had become an economic disaster zone. For the first time in the last decade, homelessness has become a daunting problem in Hickory. The Salvation Army Shelter of Hope is pressed well beyond its capacity. As a result, tonight there will be some 250 wounded souls living in the woods surrounding Hickory. They patched together makeshift cardboard lean-tos and dilapidated tents, keeping a wary eye for the police and complaining neighbors. In summer, the camps bear the oppressive markers of the South. Intense heat, draining humidity, sudden rainstorms, relentless mosquitoes, yellow jackets, gnats, snakes. In winter, snow and frost pose distinct and direct dangers. More than one homeless person has died against the cold. About a third of those living out, as they call it, are women. Some are kids, even though their parents, fearing abuse and neglect proceedings, work very hard to hide the children. Roger Cornett and 15 or so volunteers of the Open Door Homeless Relief Project, which is run out of a basement of a tiny Baptist church in nearby Conover, North Carolina. These folks spend much of their days and nights and almost all of their scarce resources trying to keep people living in the woods of Hickory alive and safe, well. Cornett is a 65-year-old retired businessman who suffers from a debilitating neuromuscular disorder. He doesn't look the part of a do-gooder as he crisscrosses across the county in his battered pickup truck, NRA sticker prominently displayed. But Cornett and his cohorts venture into often dangerous campgrounds, distributing tents, tarps, food, cook stoves, utensils, propane cylinders, blankets, trash bags, clothing, portable heaters, even dog food. I couldn't believe people were being left to live like animals in my home county, he said. A thin man in his 30s, Bill Stock, explains to me that a lot of us out here would be dead without Roger and his people. You have to learn not to look vulnerable, he says. A woman has to get with a man or she'll get hurt. Making the point, Cornett introduces me to a lesbian couple living along the wood lines. Janet Till was raped, beaten, and stabbed 2 days before we talked. She shows me 13 stab wounds. The sight is sickening. Cornett and one of his friends had helped to subdue the assailant. I don't know how long we're going to last out here, she concedes. Dorothy Edwards, who works with Roger, speaks of a young couple in their early 30s, Mark and Christina, who she can't get out of her mind. They both had lost their jobs in the recession when their respective employers closed. Eventually they sold their car and they lost their apartment. When they could no longer afford even the cheapest motel, they had to go to the woods. Christina, in tears, explained, "This is new to me. Please don't pay attention. I'm sorry for the blubbering. I know I've got to get used to this, but I've never even been camping before." When we talked, Marcia Stimpson, who was 47, and we talked for hours on several different occasions, she reported that she was then living in the Salvation Army shelter for the third time. "I'm one of their best bell ringers," she said, a top producer. "But you have to leave after 3 months, and I haven't been able to make enough money to eat and afford a place to live." You know when you hear people say, if it wasn't for my spouse, I'd be poor? That's me. She spoke with precision, but without emotion. I was self-employed, doing pretty well, working in finance, but my business crashed. I lost my job, my income, my apartment, my car. I don't fit the norm, she said. I'm not in the right categories. I don't have any addictions. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I don't do drugs. I don't have any children. I'm not pregnant. I don't have medical issues. I don't have mental illness. I've been advised to act like I'm crazy, but I won't do it. There's no funding for someone like me. I'm almost 50. It's bad now, she says, but I'm really worried what it's going to be like in 5 years or 10 years. Stimson's lived in the woods surrounding Hickory for months at a time. I'm self-sufficient, she says. For ages, I wouldn't apply for food stamps. It was too embarrassing. But she recounted it's a hard cycle. I work, save a little money, then I try to get some housing. Like I was working at Healthy Home Market, but it closed, and I lost my apartment. At first, I liked the thought of living outside. I'd enjoyed camping with my father when I was a girl. But she quickly learned you have to be secretive all the time. If people find out where you are, they'll call the cops or they'll steal your stuff, or worse. She lived most of the time with a friend, Dave, so men would generally leave her alone. But even then, she didn't feel safe. She told me, to tell you the truth, in the middle of the night, I find raccoons even more terrifying than men. Stimson packed all her belongings in a trash bag every morning, took them with her so no one would steal them. When I'd come back, she said, I have to sneak past the mobile homes at the edge of the road. If they saw her, they'd report her. The morning wasn't so bad. I'm an early riser, she said. If I get out of the woods by 4:45, then you don't have to worry much about being seen. So I was shocked when I first moved to Hickory and saw that there were hundreds and hundreds of people living in the woods. Lots of them living in cars, lots couch hopping, going from place to place. Before that, I had never thought of people living in their cars as the lucky ones, like she did. There's some amazing people here, she said, like the Open Door folks, Rogers folks, but mostly no one can stand the sight of homeless people. We give them the creeps. Stimson's tough existence wears and debilitates. In words I haven't been able to forget, she explained. When you've lost your job and you lost your savings and you lost your home and your car, and then I even lost my cat, who was very dear to me. I know that sounds funny or stupid, but losing my cat hurt me deeply, because when you lose everything, you lose your sense of being a person. You lose your own independent identity. You lose your own space to fill in the world. That's the phrase I've had a hard time letting loose of. It's hard to remember that you're still a human being, that you have a chance at a decent life, or that you deserve one, that you are worthy of existence. That's the first one. Second, Wayne County. Pat Yates, former director of Literacy Connections in Wayne County. She spent her whole life in Goldsboro ministering, I think, to second chance students. There's every reason for Goldsboro to be better off than it is, she says, given the resources, the river, the Air Force, the train. Yates' theory, moved to the language of her own discipline, is that the underlying cause of a lot of wrenching problems for Wayne County is low literacy. For literacy, she obviously, consistent with her livelihood, adopts a bolder, more encompassing definition. Literacy means the ability to function effectively in the world. In the old days in Goldsboro, she said, real literacy wasn't necessarily required to get a decent job. Good, family-sustaining jobs weren't dependent on those sort of skills. But that's all changed. Now, Seymour Johnson Air Force Base is not only the largest aggregate employer in the county, but all the workers that serve the base, and then all the federal, state, and city and county employers, and the 68 major manufacturing companies in the area. All these jobs require analysis, language, technical skills. But 1 in 10 adults in Wayne County is completely illiterate. 1 in 4 reads below the 3rd grade level. Almost 60% read below a high school level. That creates a sense in many, Pat says, that they are stuck in Goldsboro, while the children of many from more affluent locals end up leaving Eastern North Carolina. We end up exporting a lot of folks who could probably help us make things better, she says. And the county's been comfortable keeping people in their boundaries, letting them stay there. There's a strong sense of isolation, one person, one group from another. I've got mine. That's the end of the issue for me, Pat says. The people of influence and resources sometimes prefer not to talk about the challenges of poverty. They don't really want other people to talk about it either. Danielle Baptiste graduated from Goldsboro High School, UNC, and then the widely lauded North Carolina Teaching Fellows Program. And then she served 6 years in the U.S. Air Force, separating as a captain. Now she is operations director at Dillard Academy, and she sees close hand the challenges faced by children living in intense, concentrated poverty. I take kids home with me sometimes, she says. My son is a 4th grader, and he expects it. It's a little like bringing a friend home, but of course it's really more than that. Sometimes the boys just need to come home and relax and not be terrified. One little boy came over a few weeks ago and said he loved being able to sleep and not be scared. He really wished his mom could come stay too. It made him scared for her staying there alone. At one point, his mom called and asked if he would come home because she was too scared to stay by herself. My son knows that a lot of these little boys have a much different life than he does. It bothers him. He's always given away the money we give him, even though it can be scary in our neighborhood too. We live on the cusp of the hood. She laughs and says, I can't get pizza delivered to my house. We did a program recently with a group of former gang guys, Danielle says. They were doing some work in the community, tattooed up, but serving hot dogs and Cokes for the kids, trying to help out. We asked the local paper to come do a story, and thankfully one reporter came. But he asked if we could send the kids back up to the school, back to the main road, because he was too scared to go in the neighborhood where they lived. We had a good team in the soccer league, she said, last year. When we started winning, people began demanding IDs and addresses for the kids, like we were cheating. These children are almost completely cut off from the broader world, Danielle says. Even people I talk to in Goldsboro say to me, are you really going to go over to that side of town? Only troubled kids go to that school. Baptiste explains, when I was in the Air Force, I felt like I was doing a lot to serve my country. But it was nothing like the service I'm doing here. When she sees a light come on in these kids' eyes, it moves her soul. She grew up just across the road from the school's tough surroundings. When I'm able to help one of these troubled kids who may be homeless and traumatized, it gives my life meaning, Danielle says. It wears me out sometimes, but not always. I enjoy it and I'm inspired by it. My husband is great. When it's really tough, we have a date night. Having teachers who care is especially important for this population. The kids know immediately who really cares about them and who doesn't. So do the parents. They can see right through you. Kinston, 3rd. Dr. Pradeep Gurungam is a heart specialist in Kinston over Lenoir County. Lenoir is one of the state's poorest counties, you know. The doctor had big city options, but he prefers the quiet, friendlier life of Eastern North Carolina. He has a thriving practice that includes a potent commitment to the impoverished residents who are uninsured and who can't pay his fare. They are typically, he says, hard-working folks who struggle economically, waiters, maintenance workers, cooks, laborers, retail employees. He says as a heart doctor, he tries to see his poorest patients once a month because they tend to be at greater risk of dying. The failure to expand Medicaid, he said, has had a devastating impact on his low-income patients. The most wrenching of those consequences occurred last year when one of his patients, who made about $10,000 a year working in a local diner, faced severe dangers of heart failure from a genetic abnormality. Dr. A had treated her in the emergency room initially at Lenore Memorial. He was able to stabilize her and send her home, but her heart remained weak. She was in her early 60s. Her sister had died from the same malady. She needed a defibrillator, which for an uninsured patient would cost over $70,000. She couldn't get coverage on the open market because she didn't make enough money. She couldn't qualify for the subsidies of the Affordable Care Act because she was too poor. I saw her for several months, he said, but I was unable to get the defibrillator. As a result, the waitress died. We could have saved her, he said. I treated her for free. The medicines she needed weren't that expensive, so I could pay for them myself. But we couldn't get the device she needed. She'd be alive today if we accepted Medicaid expansion. He said, people don't like to hear that, but the simple fact is she'd be alive today if she lived in any of the 36 states that have accepted Medicaid. She died because she's a Tar Heel. She died because she's from North Carolina. Fourth, Durham. And this is last, I promise. Nashonda Huqoq has taught in very high poverty Durham schools for 20 years. She estimates in a typical year, 20 of her 26 students live in extreme poverty. They are, again, kids who often don't get enough to eat, who sometimes don't own coats, who wear the same clothes day after day, who live in houses or apartments containing almost no food, little furniture, in dangerous neighborhoods, unsafe buildings. Cook students know the trauma of coming home to the eviction notice or explaining they couldn't do their homework last night because the electricity had been cut off. They have scarcely traveled out of their neighborhoods or gone to restaurants or seen interstate highways or been to the mountains or the coast, though they live in Durham. Many are from single-parent households with the mother, or less often the father, works long hours, often on the night shift, so that even third or fourth grade students live largely unattended. Cook reports that the barriers experienced by such children have markedly increased in the last decade and a half, as parents have lost jobs or more often began working longer hours for lower wages. The kids try to hide it. I'll go on a home visit and there's no food, no couch, no table, not a stick of furniture, no bed. The kids will say, please don't tell anyone, Miss Cook. We're okay. But she explains, I grew up in public housing myself. I know they're acting out, and I know why. Cook directs an inspiring program called Men of Honor on a volunteer basis in Durham, beyond her regular teaching duties. It provides a different space, a safe haven for kids facing challenging circumstances. We alter clothes, we wash clothes, we give away clothes. We have a shelf with clothes arranged by size, since so many of our kids don't have winter clothing. Poverty drives everything here, she said. We even altered our start time because we didn't want kids standing out at the bus stop without coats, waiting for the bus to come. We hate snow days and extended vacations. The kids have their eyes on the food bags at the back of the room after they are delivered to the classroom. They know they don't know when they're going to eat again. We also have a share table at the back of the room. The kids will take anything home. They ask, sort of eyes wide, can I take this to my little brother at home? It breaks your heart. But my boys don't come in with their heads down, she says. They do their homework. We talk about how to treat girls, how to deal with the police, about drug abuse, about their preparations for the world. Grades have improved. Suspension rates have dropped. They do college tours. I take them, and I say, I expect you to be here. I'm going to demand it of you. Don't tell me that your only career chances are in rap or the NBA. When we spoke, Cook had just been invited to high school graduations at 4 different schools across Durham by students who each explained that they would never have made it except for her interventions many years earlier. Nashonda Huqoq admits that it's more discouraging now, and some days it can be hard to keep up. But I've got a great reason to put up with it all. That's these kids. When they improve, I'm lifted up. Huqoq is an 8th generation teacher. It is literally in her blood. I love working with students who have the tougher path, she smiles. Huqoq's father's a preacher. He says it's a calling. She says, I'm where God wants me to be. One of my own favorite former students is a woman named Jessica Holmes. You might have heard of her, at least in the paper. She's now a young lawyer and chairman of the Wake County Commissioners. Only a little more than a decade ago, though, before she did her undergraduate in law work at UNC, she was struggling heroically with the traumas of extreme poverty in Pender County on the Eastern Plain. I had these angel teachers that saved me, she said, fighting back tears. They never really spoke about it. They didn't make me feel guilty. They acted like what they were doing for me was just normal. When you come home from where I grew up, teachers can be the dividing line between a teenage drug abuser or a pregnancy and a committed student. Holmes thinks that she had teachers who were committed to ending intergenerational poverty one student at a time. I'm not really so far removed, she said, from the life of those high poverty kids. 5 kids in my family, a single mother, shuffle from homeless shelter to homeless shelter. We changed schools all the time. I didn't know until I went to college that some people had showers and air conditioners and central heat in their houses. It was only then I began to learn that people had computers and books to take home, or parents to read to them, or to take them to their games, or to pick them up after school. I'm asked all the time now to go to school programs as a county commissioner, and the students invariably ask, what was your favorite book when you were a little girl? And I say, I don't know. I never had a book. It was a different world. The only attorney I ever met, she said, was ones dealing with the arrest of my neighbors or my relatives. Our conversations would include who got shot in the neighborhood, was there a drug bust next door last night? I thought it was normal to come home and have the lights cut out. I knew in some sense that the D-boys were doing things they shouldn't, but they seemed like pretty good folks to me. They bought me clothes and sometimes gave me things to eat. They were taken away sometimes by the police, but I didn't really put the pieces together. I have 4 younger brothers and sisters. I think the pressure is always greater on the older kids. I always thought it was my responsibility to make sure they had something to eat, not my mother's. I was much more worried for them than for myself. At the end of the month, after the food stamps ran out, I'd freak out. How do we make it 3 more days, 4 more days? I felt like it was my responsibility to figure it out, and if I didn't, I was failing my sisters. Jessica Holmes believes that her teachers made it possible for her to escape, to become a professional, an elected public official. It started in the 2nd grade, she said. My teacher would come around in the morning, put apples and fruit in my backpack. Holmes just thought at first that the school was a friendly place, and they were giving food to everybody. I thought the teachers were just really nice people. Later, a high school tennis coach would make sure that I had a ride home after practice. And then when a ride didn't come or things were very tough at home, the coach would let me stay at her house. She eventually began helping with my classes, checking my attendance, helping me prepare for tests. She kept doing it when tennis season was over, and then later so did my drama teacher. They never really spoke about it. They didn't want to make a big deal of it. They didn't want credit for it. That's just the kind of people they were. For all the talk about bad teachers, Holmes tells me, I know that angel teachers saved my life. What is the price tag for saving a kid's life? My goal here is to sort of paint a portrait of some of the challenge that surrounds us. It's also true that you can't talk about poverty. You can't end it there, not right now in North Carolina, without at least mentioning what's happened in North Carolina the last 10 years. Low-income people have learned that there's one thing worse than a kind of long-standing North Carolina tradition of ignoring poor people. A government can actually target the impoverished, So thinking about these inequities that I've described, just hinted at, let me just say this. Since 2013 in North Carolina, we have one rejected proffered Medicaid coverage for 463,000 poor North Carolinians, though the feds would pay almost the whole tab, costing us billions of healthcare dollars, hundreds of millions of tax dollars, tens of thousands of jobs annually, a number of houses, and Harvard indicates, more importantly, every year 1,000 or more Tar Heels die as a result of that decision. And thousands of us lose opioid addiction treatment, though we have one of the highest addiction rates in the country. A few months later, we enacted the largest cut to an unemployment compensation program in American history, taking us from the middle of the pack to the country's stingiest program, last place. The next year, we became the first state in American history, the only state, to abolish its earned income tax credit, raising the taxes on working families, making about $35,000 a year. We enacted 3 years of income and sales tax reforms that gave large cuts to the top 5% and raised the taxes of the bottom 40%. We removed over 100,000 poor kids from food stamps, despite the money coming again from the federal government, so it saved us not a penny. We required drug testing for Work First recipients, and we've kept at it even after it's been proven to be a colossal waste of money. We ended the state's entire appropriation to legal aid. We made it nearly impossible to waive fees for indigents in criminal cases. We cut child care subsidies. We cut the dental care program for poor kids in the public schools. We doubled down, making it illegal again for cities to raise the minimum wage. We repealed the Racial Justice Act. We appealed the North Carolina Access to Civil Justice Act. I could go on if I had the stomach for it. I do have a stomach, but not for that. The frank truth is, if the exclusions and indignities of American race and poverty are right, then our Constitution's wrong. If the debilitations of those locked at the bottom are acceptable, then our scriptures are wrong. If these denials of equal citizenship and humanity are permissible, then we pledge allegiance to a cynical illusion, not to a foundational creed. And I think we know it. It's like Lyndon Johnson said one time, we may not know everything, but we know the difference between chicken shit and chicken salad. Johnson wasn't always crude. He was just almost always crude. I spent a lot of my youth protesting Lyndon Johnson. Some of you did. He horrified in war. He was this big, complicated, inconsistent, hypocritical, larger-than-life Texan. I'm from Mesquite, Texas myself. He would holler at you, wave his arms, sweat on you, spit on you. I don't know why I'm drawn to him. But he also taught that American poverty touches both our national conscience and our personal meaning. Under circumstances not enough unlike our own, he said this, and I'll stop. Rarely in any time does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself. Rarely are we met with the challenge not to our growth or our abundance or our security, but rather to the values and purposes and meaning of our beloved nation. And should we defeat every enemy, and should we double our wealth and conquer the stars and be unequal to this task, then we would have failed as a people and as a nation. For with a country as with a person, what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? So I'll stop there, and we can do questions if you want, or we can all jump off a cliff. Okay. Thanks. Questions? I won't bite you. Yes, sir.
Who's to blame?
A lot of us, all of us. This is a public problem and a private problem. It is a problem sometimes brought on by poor people themselves, at least added to. But we want to say this. We've decided this one thing. This is the richest nation on earth. We have the most poor people of any advanced nation. And we structured ourselves in ways to allow ourselves to be the most unequal nation on earth and in history. Number one, that means that's a decision we've all signed on to, whether we meant to or not, whether we wanted to or not. I talk a lot about poverty, and I realize clearly that some folks think in North Carolina that poverty is not the concern of the public, not the concern of government. That it simply is to be remedied, if it is, by the private sector or the religious sector. And I understand that. I don't buy it. I could explain to you why I think we have something which is in radical opposition to the notion of a level playing field. But even if I did buy that, even if some of us think poverty is only for the charitable sector and the religious sector, it's not a matter for government, then it's clear we're failing on both fronts. So that means there's great work to be done on both fronts. I would say this, I spent a lot of time in low-income communities the last 12 or 13 years in North Carolina. I tend to come away with 4 lessons from that. The first is very heavily represented in this book, and that is that the level of hardship experienced by our sisters and brothers is far more pronounced than almost all of us understand. The hardship is potent and defining, and it violates our claimed commitments. So the hardship is worse than we think. Secondly, it's also fair to say you cannot spend years in low-income communities without coming away with the notion that there is unbelievable charitable work happening in every corner of North Carolina by people of astonishing selflessness, often religiously driven and dedicated. Even more often, this was a great surprise to me, what's really astonishing is what poor people will do for other poor people. What they will spend, what they will dedicate. And I say this, particularly poor black people, what they will do for their sisters and brothers when they ain't got 2 dimes to rub together is maybe the most astonishing of things that one could learn. So secondly, the way I put it, if Mother Teresa were alive today, she would not be lonely in North Carolina. Third, if we could line up all those people doing that remarkable work and put them in this room, every one of them would say this, including all these people in Goldsboro who I'm talking about. They would say, no matter how hard we work, we cannot make the gulf between what needs to be done and the resources that we have. If they were fancier, they would say with Augustine that charity cannot make up for a want of justice. And fourth, every one of those people, if they were standing here, would say, despite what you might read in the newspapers, despite the claims of an improved economy, which is great in some ways, this issue that I'm describing, the plight of the bottom quarter, gets worse every year, not better. So we have hardship far more pronounced than we think. We have people doing astonishing work to try and combat it, hope against hope. They can't make up the gulf, and we are losing ground, not making ground. That's, to me, is the hard lesson of a lot of time in low-income communities in North Carolina. So it's everybody's issue, I think, for your question. But we don't act like it is. Yeah. Yes?
I have a question about what is, I know there are common characteristics, but is there anything that, after your study of this, that's unique to Goldsboro that makes us different?
Well, there's a lot that makes Goldsboro different and a lot that makes it the same. When I I was telling folks at dinner, when we first came here, we thought we were going to concentrate on studying the educational system because there's a lot to be learned about the educational system in Wayne County and Goldsboro. But as we interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of low-income people, what we couldn't escape was the wrenching stories of people living in low-income housing, describing the danger, the sort of terrifying circumstance of their lives in Goldsboro, North Carolina, a wonderful community. We talked to people who said, I choose my school for my kid based on who will pick up my two kids on the front porch, rather than having to walk 3 blocks to the regular public school pickup because kids get shot in my housing development. I worry about gunshots. And, there are people who are far more expert than I am about public housing and the like, and there are challenges. There are a lot of folks in public housing who maybe don't behave the way that you want to. But let me tell you this. We interviewed tons of people in public housing in Goldsboro who are remarkable human beings. They're among, one thing about interviewing low-income people, it's a great antidote to the kind of broad perceptions that we hear about poor people. People who are struggling, who work, they don't work 20 hours a week, 30 hours a week, they work 60 hours a week. They have kids that they have a greater dedication to and resilience and strength than anyone I've ever known. And yet they are living in survival circumstances too frequently. So we sort of ended up, not purposely, but changing our focus and looking at Goldsboro, looking at the housing projects here largely. Now those are often housing projects which were built with the best of intentions, but it can't be the case that this is the best we can do in the United States, having people live in the strongest people, the most remarkable and resilient people living in utter terror for their children. I spent, just talking about this broadly, I spent 2 years interviewing a group of about 15, 18 low-income women in Charlotte through a good partnership we had down there with Crisis Assistance Ministry. They try to keep people out of homelessness, right at the edge of uptown Charlotte. And I would go down there every 2 months, and I'd meet with these maybe 18, they happened to be all women, they were women of color, and we would meet from maybe 6 to 9:30 or something, and I would just ask them to talk about the challenges, and it was remarkable, astonishing. The degree of challenge and hardship that they faced, also the strength and resilience and faith and character with which they faced it. I will tell you what, I have no doubt, and we're spending 2 years with that group of women, that's the strongest group of people I've ever known in my life. The most admirable, the most resilient. While we were meeting, during having those sessions, first, the legislature made a decision concerning Medicaid, which cut about 2/3 of them off of health care. So they're working 50 hours a week, trying to keep their kids from getting hurt in their communities and staying in school. The legislature takes away the health care. Second, what they would all say to a person, they weren't rude, but they would say if pressed, it's the wages, stupid. They wouldn't say stupid, they were too nice for that. But they would say, look, I've been working in my job for 14 years. I make $8.70 an hour. I work hard, I'm a good worker. The people I work for know I'm a good worker. I've gotten raises of maybe 24 cents in the last decade. They know that you cannot live on $8.50 an hour in Charlotte, North Carolina. They know that, and yet they don't seem to care. I sort of ask, why is it acceptable to let you know I'm living right at the edge of subsistence? All these women were lined up. That's how we met them. 300 or so people lined up every morning in Charlotte at the crisis ministries, hoping to avoid homelessness because they're getting evicted. So crisis ministries would help them with vouchers and the like. They also knew that just over that ledge, on the other side of the highway, there were folks living in the woods in Charlotte, this mecca economically, and they were determined beyond anything else in life that their kids were not going to be homeless. That's all they thought about. But we said during that time, well, we're going to make it illegal again to raise the minimum wage. Third, the legislature cut their subsidy for child care by 60%. So that women sitting around that table told me that my child care bill was $150 a month. Now it's $400 a month. Where am I supposed to get that additional $250? I talked to them about this at the welfare office, and they said, well, the only thing you can do is quit your job. Then you can get more money. He said, I'm not quitting my job. You don't get anywhere quitting your job. So with that in my head, I would go down and talk to the legislature, and they would say over and over again, well, these people are just lazy. They want to live off the fat of the land. This is a funny land to come to if you want to live off the fat of it. I'll tell you, we treat poor people more harshly than any advanced nation. If being tough on poor people reduced poverty, we'd have the least poverty instead of the most. And anyone in the State House or in my house who thinks they're more admirable than that group of women has got a big mistake on their shoulders. So we frequently assume things about poor people that aren't so, and we legislate as if they were. I'm going to mention one more thing, and then I know I'm getting where I'm going to make you throw things at me. But perceptions, all right? We passed a bill 3 years ago that said a number of Work First recipients were going to have to get drug tested. So that was passed. It included a pilot program, which said after this first year, we're going to do a study and find out what the results of this drug testing program are. So they do the pilot program, and it reveals that I think fewer than 2% of those who were tested positively for drugs. I told them, I said, hell, if y'all wanted to do some drug tests, come down to Chapel Hill. You could go down any street in the world and you can kick 60% in a minute. 2%, now the average drug use is supposedly 10% in the United States. The guy who put it together, to his credit, said, I was shocked by that result. He said, I believed that everybody on welfare is laying out taking drugs. And everyone in my caucus, I hate to say this, the all-white Republican caucus of our legislatures, everyone in my caucus believed that too. So this is heartening. Now I wasn't there, but then someone asked, well, are you going to do away with it? Oh, no. It's costing a ton. It's yielding nothing. You're not going to do away with it? No. Why not, I wonder? Because it's still doing something cool. It's humiliating poor people. Now, they didn't say that. I said that, but that's the truth of it. So even when presented with proof that the underlying assumptions are not only uninformed, they're deadly wrong, we're apt to stick with our original guns. And I think it shames us, myself. So, I know a lot of folks in Goldsboro, a lot of folks in Wayne County are doing great work. A lot of folks in this room are doing great work. My hat goes off to you, and my heart goes out to you. And I know you all know that we got real challenges in this state. And we humiliate ourselves if we can't do better than this. I don't know, do you get up and pledge fealty to being the most unequal society in human history? Is that what we dedicate ourselves to when we put our hands on our hearts? You know, we also say, I don't want to step on any toes here because I'm really not qualified to do this. We also say this is the most Christian of nations. Somebody ought to read the Sermon on the Mount, I'll tell you. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks.